So hi, I am Jennifer and you'll meet Becky in just a few minutes. And we're excited to talk with you today about executive function and developing that in the context of listening and spoken language practice. So as you heard a moment ago, we work at the Atlanta Speech School. And so if you are not familiar with us, this graphic gives you a little bit more information. We are 6 different programs under the same roof, under the same umbrella. You probably have heard of the Catherine Ham Center, and that is our program for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. I spend most of my time in the Stepping Stones program, the yellow piece of the pie there, and that is a therapeutic preschool program for children with language and learning delays. Becky spends most of her time in the Wardlaw School, which is our K-6 program for children who have dyslexia and language-based learning disabilities. We also have a typical preschool, the Keenan Preschool. We have a clinic that provides speech, language, occupational, and learning therapeutic services. And our Rollins Center is our professional development arm. And those professionals work locally and throughout the state to coach and mentor schools as they're moving into structured literacy practices. And they also have a completely free platform, coxcampus.org. Anyone can make a membership, so go check that out because there are wonderful courses there about language and literacy. So I've been there at the school for about 5 years now. And prior to that, as you heard in my bio, I mostly worked in individual settings, either schools or clinical settings with children who are deaf or hard of hearing and their families. But now being in a classroom setting, I've had the opportunity to see so much more the daily needs of preschoolers in the area of executive function. And so really that has kind of opened my eyes to what's different in the classroom setting versus the individual setting, and how those skills are needed on a daily basis. In addition, as I was learning from colleagues at the school of how to develop and support executive function, it really resembled a lot of the things that I had always done in my individual sessions. So that just sort of got me thinking, where is the overlap with LSL practice? Where are we already doing many of these things? And where can we be intentional to add more? So that's sort of where the idea for this came about. So just briefly, what we'll do today is we're going to define executive function and identify those key behaviors and skill areas in its development, list strategies and activities within LSL practice to kind of support executive function development. And then Becky will talk even more about opportunities to continue to expand executive function development and support that throughout the child's daily life. So to start off, what is executive function? Well, many of the definitions and the information that we have here comes from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. You'll see their information, their website at the end of our presentation in the references, but also if you look them up, they have a wealth of information and lots of resources about executive function development. So they define it as mental processes that enable us to plan, focus attention, remember instructions, filter distractions, prioritize, set and achieve goals, and control impulses. So over time, this increasingly helps children to regulate their behavior and develop greater social, emotional, and cognitive competence. So really, anytime you are planning, making a decision, troubleshooting, initiating a sequence, overcoming a response that is habitual, or pursuing your goals, you are using executive function skills. The Harvard Center talks about this as sort of being the air traffic control center of the brain. So if you imagine or picture air traffic controllers like the ones you see here, as they're managing traffic coming in and out of the airport on multiple different runways, lots going on, they're not the ones who are flying the plane, but they're making sure all of it is operating together. I heard another analogy recently that you could also compare it to the conductor of an orchestra. So similarly, they're not the ones playing the instruments. Each musician is playing their own instrument, but the conductor is kind of working together to help them, make them realize how and when to play. Similarly, our brain, the executive function system in our brain, in our skills, help us to attend to stimuli, remember information, organize and prioritize those tasks, filter out distractions, and control impulses. So we do these things as adults all the time. And here's just a sample list that you can take a look at. Some of these things, I had to plan when to leave my house in order to account for traffic to get here today to start the webinar. Maybe later you're going to be planning meals for the week or sequencing steps in a recipe as you make dinner. But all of these things we do all day, every day, and we're not necessarily even thinking about it a whole lot. We just sort of do, and we picked up these skills along the way. So because we do these things all the time, we often assume that children just develop these skills naturally, or that they will develop these skills without a whole lot of input from us. But that's not entirely the case. Certainly genetics provide the blueprint and the potential for children to develop executive function skills, but really those early home and learning environments that they're in make the difference in whether or not they reach their potential. So these skills have to be developed through practice and through engagement and relationship and experiences with their parents, caregivers, and educators. So here's another graphic from the Harvard Center that really shows the development of executive function skills throughout an individual's lifetime. So you can see that they start developing at birth. And there's a rapid period of development between the ages of 3 to 5 years during those early preschool years. And then there's another spike during the adolescent years, and then it sort of levels off as you get into adulthood. So interestingly, this time period of very rapid development overlaps much of the early intervention and preschool years when so many of us are working with kids who are deaf or hard of hearing in developing those listening and language skills. So it is really important that we also take into consideration executive function skills and how we can impact those during this time period. So why are these skills important? Well, in general, they can help propel you towards your potential, that potential that you're born with. But if there are weaknesses or those skills are not developed, it really can hinder you from making progress towards your goal. These skills really have implications for school readiness, academic achievement, social skills, health, and then future employment and contributions to society. These are fundamental skills that lay the foundation for those adaptive and goal-directed behaviors that enable the child to override those more automatic or impulsive thoughts, allow them to achieve strong academic performance. And some studies have even shown that the inhibitory control that children have in childhood continues to have an impact on them as adults as many as 30 years later in a variety of areas. So when we're talking about executive function skills, we're putting them in 3 main areas. We'll talk about some additional sub-skills a little bit later, but mainly they fall into these 3 crucial areas, which is working memory, inhibitory control, and mental or cognitive flexibility. So in very young children, they found that those first 2 areas, working memory and inhibitory control, are very closely linked and have similar neural bases in the brain. Cognitive flexibility comes along a little bit later than working memory and inhibitory control, but it builds upon those and requires the other 2 processes in order to develop. Of course, as you can imagine, there are lots of points of interdependence between these, and that's some of what we'll talk about as we talk about developing the skills. And then just one other thing to mention, as you're reading and maybe learning more about executive function, you might see them referred to as hot or cool skills. Sometimes that's a term that's used in the literature. And just as kind of a brief overview, those hot skills are more those skills where emotions are running high, behaviorals are externalized, so it might be the kind of thing that might get a child in trouble a little bit, and your motivation is affected by reward. Whereas the cool skills are not as linked to emotion, your behavior is a little bit more internalized, might look a little bit more like daydreaming, and it's not as motivated by reward. So keep those things in mind as we talk about some of the different skills. Okay, so working memory, what is this? Well, it's really the capacity to retain and manipulate small, distinct pieces of information over a very short period of time. You might think of it like the Post-it note of your brain. So as you are remembering these small pieces of information, you'll have them for a short period of time, and then when you no longer use them, you might discard them to make room for more information, new information, or some things, if they are very important and are needed for the long term, might be used, moved over to long-term memory. This includes verbal working memory, so it's sort of that auditory loop or self-talk that you have in your brain, as well as nonverbal working memory, so visual imagery or the visual loop that goes through your brain. And here are just a few examples of what this might look like in the daily life of a young child. So following various directions, holding on to those directions in mind in a classroom, listening to a story and remembering the details and events in the story, going through a daily routine and recalling the steps in order of a daily routine, or if you're playing a game, remembering the rules, what other players have just done, that sort of thing. The next area we'll talk about is inhibitory control. So this is a skill that's used to filter out our thoughts, set priorities, and really pause before an impulsive action or response. So really this involves suppression of your dominant response, what you would typically do, and activating your non-dominant response, what is not necessarily the first thing that comes to mind or first thing in your nature. So these skills allow us to resist temptations, filter out distractions. It supports selective, focused, and sustained attention. And it also helps us in the long run to complete non-preferred tasks and delay gratification for preferred tasks. So a few examples of what this might look like is a child ignoring something that's interesting in their environment. If you're in class, waiting to take your turn, raising your hand, waiting until you're called on to take your turn. For young children, resisting the temptation to take a toy away from another child. And then in the last photo, I think we've all seen kids who enjoy dropping utensils or cups or food off of the high chair at mealtime to see what will happen. And that's sort of an impulse, and they're learning to inhibit that impulse. The third area we'll talk about is cognitive flexibility. So the way that you shift your attention or shift your priorities in the face of new information, new demands, new circumstances. So this might allow us to apply different rules in different settings. It allows us to be creative and problem solve when there's new information. And it supports us being persistent and resilient when a challenging or unexpected or stressful situation comes up. So a few examples of this for young children, learning to adapt to changes. You know, if your schedule changes in the middle of the day, can they adapt to that change? Adapting to a new caregiver, a new friend, a new playmate that enters their environment. Using a familiar toy and being creative and using it in a symbolic or in a different way. Or maybe following rules that are different in different places. So for example, you might be able to run around and use a loud voice. What just happened? My slideshow.
That's weird that it just randomly.
Yeah, let's.
Are you plugged in, by the way?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Here we are. Following rules that are different in different places. So for example, if you're running around on the playground, you can run and you can use a loud yelling voice. If you are inside, you might use walking feet and a quieter voice. So some additional sub skills that go along and overlap some of these different areas include attention, whether you're able to orient to an item or a stimulus, whether you're able to selectively attend to one thing and not another, or maybe divide and shift your attention between different stimuli, whether you can sustain attention to a task over an extended period of time. We talked a little bit about response inhibition, whether you're stopping yourself from doing that habitual response, again, suppressing that dominant response and activating the non-dominant response, and following through on your goal without distraction to completion. A few other things that are involved include organization. So if you have a process or a sequence, recalling multiple steps of that process, and then also planning and placing those steps in order, as well as the systems that we use to categorize information or categorize steps within a process. Metacognition is an executive function skill where you observe what's happening and what you're thinking. So it's really thinking about your own thinking. You're self-reflecting and self-monitoring, and then using that information to adjust your response, either in the moment or for the next time you encounter this circumstance. And of course, time management is an executive function skill also. So initiating a task, knowing how much time that task will take, prioritizing and planning enough time for a task and the different steps within that task, and then transitioning from one step or one task to the next. So we know, from research and also from our own experience that children will vary very widely in their profile of executive function skills. So this might be within the same child even. Their profile of skills, they might have aspects that are stronger or aspects that are weaker, as well as seeing differences from child to child. This is true for adults too. If you reflect on that list we provided earlier or your executive function skills, you might have areas where you are stronger or weaker also. And at the end of the presentation, you'll see in our references, there's an interesting quiz you can take online where you are looking at your own skills and where you're stronger or weaker. And so this might be interesting for you to know as of your executive function skills, but then also with the children in your household or the children that you're working with, where you might need support as you're helping and coaching them. So within kids, some of this varies depending on their age, their maturity, their history, including their medical history, what experiences they've had up to that point, and what relationships they have with adults in their lives to help build these skills. And of course, we know that there will always be children who struggle a little bit more with some executive function skills than others, even if we're putting lots of great factors and development into place. And a lot of that you'll hear later on from Becky of how to support and further develop and accommodate if you are starting to see some of those weaknesses. In addition, we know that this happens very much in the early period of life, when you also have lots of neural plasticity, where your brain is growing and changing so much. And so that can be a real benefit in working on executive function skills at this age, that you can develop these skills. But the flip side of that is that these skills might also be vulnerable at this period of time too. So if there are adverse childhood events happening, such as trauma or a chaotic home environment, abuse or neglect or violence, any of those kinds of things, that might impact executive function skills, just like it impacts all of the other skills that we're looking at as therapists and educators and parents. So as we are developing these skills, as we said before, we know that children are not born with these already developed executive function skills. So they really need to be developed through practice and through experiences and relationships with the adults in their lives. So it's important for adults to set up the environment and the frameworks for children to be successful in these skills. So we can do this by establishing predictable routines, providing cues and prompts, breaking larger tasks into smaller steps, which we'll talk about more later, and using some of these scaffolds, just like you might have scaffolding along the side of a building as a temporary support to help you as you are building the building. You use those scaffolds as you're helping to build the child's skill. And this is not foreign to us as therapists, as educators, as parents. You know, we're often doing these things. I know in auditory, verbal, listening, and spoken language practice, we might provide more scaffolding in the way of auditory acoustic highlighting, or we might use more gestures at the beginning. We might use a slower rate of speech. And as time goes on, with time and practice, the scaffold can be gradually removed for greater independence. And so therefore, the same way we can kind of gradually remove some of these scaffolds for executive function skill 2. So let's talk a little bit about how we can build some of these executive function skills through LSL practice. So in general, we know that playful engagement and language together leads to learning. We talked just a moment ago about scaffolding and using that I do, we do, and then you do framework where we teach that expectation, we model, and then we work together with some scaffolds as we gradually release control for greater independence as we go. As we're talking about a lot of these areas of LSL practice, I want to recognize maybe where we are already working on many of these skills. You know, there are many areas where we're probably already working on these things, but we don't even realize it. And then are there areas where we can be intentional and where we can add additional opportunities for greater executive function learning to the activity? And also, I would even say, too, how can we inform families that we're working with and other stakeholders about executive function, this crucial area of development in young children? How can we inform them about what we're working on alongside our listening and language skills? So when I was looking at activities, you know, many of the resources out there that you see from the Harvard Center, for example, they have a great section that has lots of different activities and areas where you can work on things. They have it broken up by age level, but I thought it made a little bit more sense to look at early listening and language skills and then later listening and language skills. Because as we all know, we might get a new listener who's an infant, but we also might get a new listener who's a little bit older, who's a preschooler or even older than that. So I wanted to kind of think more about tasks and where we were in that process rather than age specifically. So the most basic foundational skill that we can work on in executive function is perception. So if we're not able to perceive what's happening around us in the environment, in this case, sound, we will really have a hard time learning from that information and making sense of it, and then building further learning from there. So we do this with new listeners frequently with sound awareness. So this might be perceiving noisemakers or environmental sounds, knowing when a sound is present and when it's absent or when it stops. Awareness of voices, response to music. When we have kids responding at those very early stages to ling sounds to make sure that they are detecting all of the sounds, we're working on perception. And even audiologists are working on this area as well, as they are working on various aspects of audiometry within the sound booth. So really what we're asking them to do is selective attention. So if they are focused on an activity or a task that's in front of them and the sound is presented, they have to stop what they're doing, selectively attend to the new sound, and shift their attention to that sound to get meaning out of it. We're asking them if it is important and they can learn from it to sustain their attention and provide joint attention before they shift their attention back. So I can't really overstate, anybody who's worked with me knows that I really make sure that this area is solid before we move on, because it is the foundation of everything that comes along after that. And I would even add that the idea of shifting attention and that skill is something that kids will continue to use and continue to practice and learn in different ways long after they are experienced listeners. An example, just this week in my kindergarten class, a little girl came in late because she'd been out in an appointment. We were in the middle of story time, and as soon as she opened the door and walked in, every set of eyes in the room turned and looked at her and said hello to her. And as she was unpacking and getting settled, I knew the profile of the kids in my class and knew that this was something that they had still not yet mastered. And so I gave them a verbal scaffold and said, okay, everyone, now we're going to shift our eyes and our thoughts back to the story, to kind of give them that verbal scaffold. And hopefully with time, they'll self-monitor and cue to do that for themselves. From there, we often move on to activities of learning to listen and vocal play. So things like sound and object association with learning to listen sounds. We might work on early phrase understanding, early directions, vocal play and matching and imitating sounds and vocal play. And we're working on name calling and responding to one's name also. So of course, we're working on working memory here. We want them to hold on to the sound, hold on to the word, hold on to the phrase or the direction in their mind long enough to act on it. This is especially true for using a hear it before you see it strategy, where they have to hold on to that sound before they see the object that we're talking about. And of course, we want them to selectively attend to the item that is in front of them. Sometimes this involves inhibitory control. So looking at those farm animals that are there, if I want a child to identify and match a sound to the horse, for example, but they're more interested in playing with the cow, they have to inhibit that desire to reach for and play with the cow because I've asked for the horse. There's also a fair amount of inhibitory control involved in early vocal play, believe it or not. When children are new listeners, often they are vocalizing frequently, maybe even constantly, as they're trying out new sounds and they're trying out their voice and they're listening to themselves for the first time. But if we want them to imitate and work on some turn taking, they have to inhibit their desire to keep vocalizing and pause a little bit to let someone else get a turn in. So that's a way that we're working on inhibitory control very early on. There's also a good bit of metacognition involved when you're working on imitation and developing your auditory feedback loop. So remember, the auditory feedback loop is where you listen to what someone else says, you listen to what you yourself say, and you think, does that match? So if I said moo and the child repeats boo, I might say, listen again. And I'm using scaffolds, I'm using acoustic highlighting to maybe move in, emphasize that sound, moo. And the child has to think, okay, what was it that I heard? What did I say? And reflect on, what am I doing with my mouth to make that sound, and how can I change that? So that's the earliest form of metacognition in many ways. And of course, a lot of these activities involve cognitive flexibility too. So for example, I brought some props. So if I'm playing with a dog and I have a little stuffed dog, but I also have a little plastic dog, or I have a picture of a dog, the child needs to be flexible in their thinking as they're learning all three of these can be dog, even though they look slightly different. So that's another form of executive function. So when we're doing hiding and imitation games, this in many ways is working memory at its earliest form, object permanence. I know that there's still a toy I remember and I'm holding it in my mind, even if it's hidden in a box, in a bag, under a blanket, I know that it's still there. If we're doing a sequence of actions that we're imitating, pat a cake, for example, you have to hold those actions in working memory and sequence to know what comes next. And of course, just like we talked about with vocal play, there's a fair amount of inhibitory control and waiting and turn taking involved in these actions too. So think about rolling a ball back and forth with a toddler. The toddler has the ball, and if they roll it to you, they don't have the ball anymore. So that's not something they want to do. That doesn't seem very fun. So that's their impulse, is to hold on to the ball. But what we're asking them to do is suppress that dominant response, roll the ball to you so you can take a turn, and then roll it, knowing that they're going to get it back because we're going back and forth. And so that's an early form of inhibitory control too. So of course, there are lots of skills involved in finger plays, rhymes, and songs. We want them to sustain attention to the rhyme or song throughout the duration of it. We're asking them to use their working memory to remember motions or gestures, the tune, the words of the song. If it's interactive or responsive, like a call and response, they have to wait and turn take. So resist the urge to jump in too early with that E-I-E-I-O and wait until you give them the cue or until they hear it coming in the song and they know it's their turn in that way. Okay, so moving on to later on listening. So here are some examples of things that we might do with kids as they are a little bit more experienced in their listening and language skills. So we'll go through each of these. So matching and sorting. This is an activity that we frequently do in therapeutic or classroom settings. You might be asking kids to match items that are identical or match things that are a similar type. You might ask them to sort by group or by feature. You see in the picture here a very familiar task where you have little bears of different colors and bowls to match. That right there is an example of a scaffold. So if the child is not yet sure how to plan and organize, which again are executive function skills, they might need your help to scaffold it to help them to know how to start that task out. So you might do this with a visual representation, such as a bowl or a bucket or a different color paper, if you're working on sorting by color. You also might do this in verbal ways. I was doing an activity like this not long ago with a little girl where I had different color animals. And I said, okay, first we're going to sort all the green items here, the yellow here, the red here, and the blue here. And I set that up for her because she was not yet ready to plan and organize herself. So I set it up for her and then she took it from there. As time goes on, she might be able to plan and organize and set it up herself without my scaffold. We can increase the challenge a little bit by adding in an element of cognitive flexibility. So instead of sorting by color, I changed the rules on her and said, okay, now we're going to put all the horses over here, all the pigs over here, the sheep here, and the ducks here. So she has to take the rule that we were working on and shift her thinking a little bit and change to match the new rules. Beyond that, we can even add in an element of inhibitory control if we ask them to do something unexpected. So for example, with the picture here in the bowls, what if I said, we're going to put all of the small bears in the red bowl and all of the large bears in the blue bowl? Well, that might mean that some of the animals, some of the bears, the colors don't match the bowl that they're in. And so they have to kind of suppress what seems obvious there to sort by color, to do something different, to be flexible, and also inhibit their response. This next area is something that's one of my favorite activities to work on, which is following directions and auditory memory. which we know is at its heart a way to work on working memory, both verbal and nonverbal working memory. So this might include things like recalling a series or list of items from memory, following directions and changing the number of steps you're following, or varying the complexity. So how many critical elements or key details you're using in your direction. But really the learning and the development part comes in here with the scaffolding. So for example, let's take if we were looking at finding a series of items for auditory memory. This time of year, I love to work on a picnic activity, packing a picnic basket. So I might use as a visual scaffold some placeholders, some visual placeholders like this. These are just cutouts from craft foam. You could also use felt or construction paper, but it gives the child a visual representation that I want 3 items. So if I ask them and I say, I want an apple, a banana, and an ice cream cone, they have placeholders where they can put those things. Let's say, for example, they get the apple and they get the ice cream cone, but they forget the banana. So I'm not going to repeat just that one item that I'm looking for, the banana that they're missing. I'm going to repeat the whole direction because I want them to reflect, use their metacognition skills to think, okay, what do I already have? What's missing? And then it also kind of shows them the order that I asked for those items in. So I might say the apple, the banana, and the ice cream cone, repeat the whole direction, and they can identify what was missed and put it in the middle space. The same way with some of these following directions. So I have the what's in the picture. I brought the item here. I'll hold it up so you can see it, but you can see it on the screen there too. So for example, if I said, I want you to put the cow in the mud and put, I'm sorry, it's not the cow, the pig. I want you to put the pig in the mud and put the ducks in the pond. Let's say they put the ducks in the pond. Again, I'm going to repeat the whole direction. I might use some pausing and some acoustic highlighting to help them identify what it was that was missed. So I might say, put the pig in the mud and pause a little bit after I've highlighted and put the ducks in the pond so they can figure out what it was that they missed. Another example, if I'm working on a sequencing direction. So what if I said, before you put the farmer beside the fence, put the horse on the grass. They have to sequence those steps in their mind, hold in their working memory that I have to go back and get the farmer, but first I'm going to go and get the horse and kind of plan and sequence and organize that. Then if they need a little bit of support about that, I can add some additional phrases. I can use some highlighting and some pausing. And of course, I'm always asking them to use inhibitory control because I want them to listen to the whole series or the whole sequence of the direction before they act, so that they can hold the whole thing in their memory. Another area that we all like to work on is identification games. So this can happen in many different ways, using a mystery box, or maybe I Spy, or providing clues. I want to give a couple of examples of how I've changed my thinking on this based on some things that I've learned from colleagues. There's a colleague at school who uses a mystery box game, sort of like this. I brought one with me, or like one that's pictured. And the way she goes about it, I think really works on building some of those skills. So from the start, she says, I want you to wait, don't tell me. So she's setting it up for inhibitory control. She wants them to wait until all the clues or the descriptors have been given before they answer. So then she'll give them the first clue. So I'll give you a clue about what's in here. It's an animal. So she asks them, do you have a picture in your mind of what might be in the box? So she's asking them to use their nonverbal working memory to picture what could be in there. She'll give them the second clue. It's large and gray. So she'll say, does the picture in your mind match my words, match my clues? And if they say, no, it doesn't, then she'll say, okay, I want you to take that picture out and put another picture in that matches my words a little bit better. So that's asking for cognitive flexibility. And then she gives the third clue. It has a trunk, and I won't make the sound, but because I'm not great at that sound, but you can imagine. And then you ask and you open it up and it's an elephant. So just by changing sort of the way we go about an activity, you can set it up to include a little bit more practice at executive function skills while you're also working on your listening and language skills. Pretend play and storytelling involve tons of executive function skills. So a play schema, which is a play plan, is essentially sequencing and planning right there. So you have to have an idea of what you're going to do. You talk with your playmates and you decide who's going to be in what role. So you're also using your working memory there. So say you're playing restaurant. Okay, I'm the customer, you're the chef, and she's the server. You have to remember what's already been done in play as you're selectively attending to different aspects of the play. And maybe you're using your cognitive flexibility if you're using toys to represent one thing or another. You're pretending that one item is another item within your pretend play. And of course, storytelling, one of the pictures here, you see sequence cards for storytelling. That's a great way to provide a scaffold if the child is still working on storytelling skills, so they can really visually see and put those in order. Sometimes you might turn one over and see if they have a mental picture of what happened during that segment. So working on that nonverbal working memory as they're trying to recall it. And of course, games and active play. So this might be board or card games or a range of active games, interactive games. These involve a lot of inhibitory control. So if you think about red light, green light, or freeze dance, you're asking them to inhibit their response, which is to keep running or keep dancing and pause. Simon says they might want to touch their head, but Simon didn't say to touch their head. So they have to inhibit that, that instinct. I think we all know the kid who really falls apart and doesn't have that cognitive flexibility or that inhibition to let someone else take a turn or not get disappointed when something doesn't go their way. Games are a great way to work on that. Of course, you're using working memory too. So you might, this memory game that you see pictured here, you have to remember, where did I see that card, and hold that in your working memory. Maybe what's just happened in the game, what the rules are. And then if someone happens to get that set of cards before you do, you might have to be flexible and switch your game strategy. So there are lots of great skills that can be learned through games and through that active play. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to switch areas and chairs. You want me to move it over? You want to switch chairs? Okay. Okay, I'll scoot it over. Turning you over to Becky.
All right. Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying learning about all of the executive functions and all the games and activities and the intentionality that Jennifer just discussed are going to be important for setting your child on the path for success with regard to executive function development. And you're giving lots of practice and opportunities early on to build those neural pathways for your child. As they start to get a little bit as they start to get a little bit older, you might start to think about executive functions a little bit differently. So what you've hopefully got a great understanding now is what some of these executive functions are. And so you can start to tailor them a little bit more for the students that you're working with and your children at home. So there's potentially a little bit of a shift that might be happening right now if we're shifting from more of the early preschool, kindergarten age to school age, where children are starting to become a little bit more independent. And in their independence, you're going to see that they're going to start maybe doing things like getting ready for school a little bit, doing some simple routines on their own. They might make small meals, safe meals for their age, help with chores, and they're starting to problem solve some basic social challenges outside of the purview of mom, dad, or teacher. So obviously, as Jennifer was saying, you're going to continue to build opportunities for growth, and you might also sort of look at some of the executive functions a little bit differently because you're going to boost or scaffold some areas of personal strength or weakness. And what this means is, I know Jennifer was talking about scaffolding, but you might shift your focus a little bit from building some of the executive functions to accommodating and scaffolding them. And as she was saying earlier, basically you're going to provide supports to help your child with learning a new skill or your students with learning a new skill, and then you're going to gradually remove that. Or potentially it might become something that they continue to use to be more independent with their skills. So as Jennifer mentioned also, I think one way that helps me to conceptualize executive functioning and skills is to think about ourselves. As we have gotten older, we are probably accommodating our own strengths and weaknesses. So our little lady on the left looks like she might not be accommodating very well for her strengths and weaknesses. You know, she's having a hard time, and she's probably trying to do too many things without a list, without a plan. She hasn't organized anything, and chaos has ensued. And then we have the epitome of having it all together on the right. So you can start to think about these things. Like, do you use a planner? Do you use lists? How do you problem solve different situations? Do you set your timers or calendar reminders on your phone? Do you inhibit your temptations to pick up your phone and check social media or to eat that delicious cookie that's sitting over to the side of you? You know, we're not fully adept in all of these areas as adults, but one of the things that we definitely learn is how to be successful, independent, competent people. And we can start thinking about that for the children in our lives as well. So in a way, what you might think about is that you're shifting your stance a little bit to allow you to look at a problem-solving mode of how to support students. So supports, if we start with the three areas that Jennifer mentioned earlier, if we start with just looking at working memory, there's both visual and verbal working memory, and a lot of people struggle with that verbal working memory. That's definitely something that I know is my weakness. And so one of the things that will lessen the load on your short-term memory, that working memory, is something visual. Routines are going to be a great place for you to employ a visual reminder. So if we're thinking about that home environment, anything that you have a routine that your voice as the adult is the reminder is a great place to shift to allowing your child to be more independent and giving them a visual reminder so they can do these things on their own. So those examples like bedtime, leaving the house, getting ready for sports or practice, or anything where you don't want to miss a step because it's critical for the success of that plan. This is a great little bedtime routine right here. You can definitely, you know, come up with any type of plan that works for your routine. This one would be a little Velcro piece that comes up and covers it. So once the child completes that task, they move the Velcro tab up and it covers it up to show that the task has been completed. And this is just really helpful because what it also does is it allows the bedtime routine or whatever the visual reminder is to kind of be the bad guy sometimes, and the adult is not the bad guy. So you don't have to carry the weight of reminding the child to do something over and over. You keep pushing the child back to their reminder. And that just can be a nice way to deflect some of the frustration that comes from routines and being your child's working memory. You don't need to do that. That's where this visual can help you with that. The same thing would apply to a school environment. Teachers use a lot of these already because there are tons of routines in a school environment. And so using some types of planners for school environments, for school assignments or after school activities are helpful for students to keep themselves organized. Graphic organizers for just organizing their thoughts for different assignments. Teaching a child to advocate for themselves for repetition if they didn't hear something the first time, and helping them learn that they might need to take notes on it, on different things, put a note on their desk, a procedure in the classroom. And as you'll see the two pictures on the side, those are just great opportunities. If you've got a morning routine or something that an individual child needs on their desk, you can give them that routine there. Then that child can be independent. They don't have to keep coming back to the adult, and they can recognize over time, hopefully, either this can be something that they can internalize themselves, or they might even carry this over to other areas in their life where they recognize that they benefit from some of these visual supports. And in general, if we're thinking about working memory, those last two examples were really more auditory working memory supports. But if you were thinking in the terms of a child who might have a visual memory weakness, chunking information is really helpful. So giving them pockets of information. In some ways, you can think of that as sort of slots for your working memory. You want to decrease the slots. So if you put 3 chunks of information into 3 slots, that's easier to hold on to than 15 individual pieces of information. Can be a lot for a child. Also, pairing a visual with a verbal or vice versa. If you've got a child who can see things more visually but doesn't hold on to things, or I mean, if a child needs sort of the verbal to support them because that's stronger, sometimes making up songs or little phrases that help them to remember the steps can be something that really supports that the visual working memory. Notes and erasers, notes and dry erase markers are really great, especially on mirrors for kids. They think it's really fun to do. It wipes right off, but you can put a note on there for themselves and they can learn to write down what they need. And overall, you're just going to reinforce what works. If you start seeing an area that is not successful and you find something that works, capitalize on that and use it wherever you can. All right, so our next one that we're going to shift to is talking about inhibitory control. And this is always a fun one because this is something that kids struggle with. I struggle with. I mean, it's something that definitely is developmental and may take a little bit of time, but that looks like waiting, resisting a temptation of any type, biting their tongue and not saying something inappropriate. We know that kids will often just say whatever they see and they're not thinking about the time and the place. A lot of times this has to do with their emotions as well. Just recognizing that those pieces are tied together, taking turns, as Jennifer was saying, and even raising your hand before being called on is still something that many kids are working on from the preschool to the more school age, elementary school age. So you're continuing to look at opportunities to build practice into a child's repertoire. Games are a great way, especially for inhibitory control for kids this age, because it's something that they're naturally doing. And also kids are often using inhibitory control at this age outside the purview of adults. And so practicing games, which is something that they're going to be doing when they're not around adults, is a great opportunity. So Jennifer was talking about some games earlier, like Duck, Duck, Goose, Red Light, Green Light. We might have some games that kids are playing now that are more like Monopoly or Sorry. Those types of games transition to those older children, but still require you to control your emotions when you're not winning, to take turns, to inhibit even that desire to maybe want to cheat a little bit if you're not winning the game. There's also a social aspect to this as well. So this feeds into a child's just social skills, their friendship skills of understanding what it takes to be a good friend, to have that inhibitory control. Okay. So if your student or your child continues to struggle with some inhibitory control, what are some other ways that you can support this? Obviously, language. You're continuing to build language supports, but self-talk can become really helpful. And that might be teaching a child something to say when their impulses are going to tell them something else. Pair an expectation with a visual. So sometimes it helps to kind of use a hand sign, a stop sign picture with a child in those situations where they might be more prone to just, prone to their impulses. It really benefits children who have inhibitory control weaknesses to remind them before the expectation. So if you're going into a grocery store, what are the expectations before we go into the grocery store? Is it that you run up and down the aisles? Is it that you grab all of the great foods that you want? Or is it that you stay with mom? or dad, you have your hand on the cart, those types of expectations. The same thing in class. If you're leaving a classroom, what are the expectations so that a child can be successful? Again, we're sort of shifting from the parent having always to remind a child to the child being able to bring up into their own awareness what needs to be done. And that feeds into their developing their self-awareness overall. And it's okay to talk about the fact that all children have impulses, what's hard for you as an adult sometimes, how you overcome your impulses. It's simply something that many of us struggle with life in our lifetime. And so letting them know that it is something that we continue to work on, but also letting them know that there might be a negative impact to reacting to your impulses. If you're always the kid who takes the cookie that you want and your friend never gets the cookie that they want, how might that feel to somebody else? If you're in a classroom and you always have to be first in line, what about the other kids who want to be first in line? So that becomes an important discussion to have with kids along the way. There are some specific strategies. If you want to just look up, there's something called the stop, think, go strategy. It basically is going through in very detailed terms how to teach a child to stop and think before they go. But there are strategies out there for children who need a little bit more support in those areas. And the third section that we're going to talk about is cognitive flexibility. And as Jennifer was saying, this is what allows us to shift easily from one idea, train of thought, activity, or way of looking at things. As we get older, our life becomes less black and white, becomes much more gray. And sometimes kids have a hard time shifting from right or wrong to what could be sort of the grays, even as Jennifer was saying with the bears, that there's different types of bears. Some kids have only one picture of a bear in their brain. And so to challenge them to see something differently can be hard for them. So we might see some challenges in specifically with some changes in routine. If something is always done a certain way, that can be hard for a child who has some cognitive flexibility weaknesses. Problem solving, to look at something a different way when it's always been solved a certain way, that can be challenging. As we were talking about games, just games in general sometimes can have fluid rules, and those might be a little bit frustrating to some kids. And just the rules of location. You know, you take off your shoes when you get home from school, but you leave your shoes on when you're at school. Just some of those basic types of situational rules can be challenging for kids. So what we're hoping that we're trying to do to kids as they get a little bit older is we want them to be a little bit more flexible. We want them to think outside the box, and we want them to feel okay and to recognize that some of the feelings that go along with that cognitive flexibility, like shift and flex, are okay. And this one is also developmental. You're going to see younger kids will kind of work on this a little bit. It's a little bit more challenging if your older children are not showing some cognitive flexibility when they get a little bit older. And so if that is happening, then you need to just work on it a little bit more. In the schools, a lot of schools now are supporting this area and talking more about cognitive flexibility in overt terms. In some schools and ours, we use the super flex characters, or these unthinkables. And what it does is it puts a language to some of the frustrating cognitive flexibility obstacles that you might encounter in daily life. So there are these characters that you can sort of talk about, that rock brain might be visiting you. It's not that you're stuck on a topic and you can't move on to talk about something else, but rock brain is visiting. It allows students to sort of think about this outside themselves, allows you as a group to talk about something that is getting in the way, and that it also allows you to talk about cognitive flexibility, because the goal would be with these unthinkables is that Superflex, our hero, he comes in and he defeats all of these unthinkables. And so if you are stuck with any of these, it allows the group to problem solve sometimes as a whole. But again, cognitive flexibility can be supported also just with our language and sort of in our daily activities. Multiple meaning words are really a fun way to play with cognitive flexibility with kids, finding words that have the same meaning and kind of rocking their world. So there could be two different, meanings for a word. Jokes and riddles and puns are also a great opportunity for this. And then for those kids who really just have a hard time with cognitive flexibility and it's really frustrating, teaching them some coping strategies can be really beneficial, that they can overcome the frustration that might come from trying something new. In addition, teaching some calming self-talk, some relaxation, teaching that taking a break is important, and employing even social stories, which are like some very helpful stories to walk a child through a difficult situation, can definitely support these areas of weaknesses. So the idea is that you're thinking about a child's strengths and weaknesses. They may have strengths in cognitive flexibility, so I'm not implying that the strengths are not there, but for those kids who are struggling, it's really important to think about how to support them through this. And over time, what we would hope is that with the working memory, with the inhibitory control, and with the cognitive flexibility, that you're seeing some growth. And that growth can be in their individual development, but it could also be in the fact that they're employing strategies that help them to be successful and to be more independent over time. So overall, what we have talked about today about executive functioning is that they're going to continue to grow and develop over time. We have maturity, experiences, practice, opportunities to tackle challenges are all going to contribute to executive functioning development. There's a lot of research on executive functioning that shows how it contributes to just overall growth in a child. The reason we're talking about it in such early kids is that the evidence is showing that by 12 months of age, a child's experiences are helping to lay the foundation for their overall executive functioning skills. We know that they have outcomes that not only impact academics, but also social development as well. So the benefits of recognizing and understanding executive functioning development is critical for so much of a child's overall functioning. All right. So we've got our references here. I know that Jennifer mentioned also some of the research that we had been using with regard to the Harvard University Center on the Developing Child. They have a lot of great information, and that website is chock full of just articles and resources. So these will be available with the PowerPoint and also the executive functioning questionnaire for adults, which is just sort of fun. It definitely highlighted my working memory weaknesses. I kind of already knew that, but it's still fun to take it and then to think about how you've supported yourself through your lifetime.
We have questions from them.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're gonna do the Q&A part. Thank you, guys. That was awesome. I'm getting like text messages like, these speakers are so good this year. So I love it. How do you know whether it's a weak executive function skill or a typical bad behavior? Oh.
Well, I think I would start by seeing if it's something that a child can't do in all environments, or if it's just showing up in one environment. Sometimes kids obviously don't like to do certain tasks asked of them, but sometimes their behavior can also be indicative of it being harder for them. So you might ideally meet them in the middle and provide some supports to kind of get the ball rolling, to kind of motivate the child to be involved and to not show some negative behaviors, and see if that helps the situation or if it doesn't. And if it continues to be a problem and the child is not benefiting from some of the supports, it could be that there is just maybe some dislike of the activity put before them, and you might support it better with something specifically related to behavior.
That is tricky.
Yeah.
I also want to say, after these questions, we're gonna spin the wheel and pick our raffle winner. Doing my little push one more time. So please donate if you haven't. We're up to $200. We're very excited. All right. Can you see the question?
Yeah.
Okay, can you, because I don't know if they can.
Is it in the Q&A or the?
Yeah,
chat?
Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I'll go to the Q&A.
It's the why would.
Why would my
Read
Okay,
it
so
out
the
loud.
question is, why would my child show signs of ADHD, weak executive skills at home, but is completely fine at school? Can environment affect this? We could both speak about this probably, but
Sure.
I will start and say absolutely. Environment can definitely support it, positively and negatively, actually. Schools are full of routines, as I said earlier, and some kids inherently benefit from a routine. That weak attention, sometimes the routine gets you motivated, it gets you into something, it's what everyone is doing. And so once you start that process, it allows you to be successful. As I was showing earlier, also a lot of routines and things in schools are posted. There's a visual reminder, there's a teacher also there sometimes reminding a student that they need to be doing something and giving some prompts that could be helpful. So that could definitely be playing into the environmental differences. At home, I hate to say it, but it's true, but kids often expect their parents to help them a little bit more. And so it is a little bit more challenging sometimes to tease out whether a child really has a weakness in an area or whether they really just want mom or dad to help them do it, because they will. So I definitely can understand the question. Sometimes I would ask even the teacher and find out if a student can do a certain skill at school successfully, find out what's helping them to be successful at school. And also if a child can do it at school successfully, maybe there's something that you can do at home that mirrors it, or you can hold your child accountable in a different way.
And excuse me, I would add, I'm assuming this might be a child you're talking about who's deaf or hard of hearing, and the impact of listening fatigue can be real. I'm dealing with a situation right now with a child who has some weaknesses in executive function, and when I see them after school, it is readily apparent. I happened to see them one day recently on a day that they didn't have school, but I had school, so they still came to see me after school, and it was like night and day. And so it just got the child and the parent and I talking about the impact of listening fatigue, and maybe there were less demands on the child that day during the day because they were not doing all of their normal tasks and using all of their executive function resources during the day. So that could be a factor too. In addition to, I was thinking of all the same things that Becky was mentioning.
Another one.
Okay, my child prefers to be busy doing something while having conversations. Is that a sign of a lack of executive functioning? Will they outgrow this as they mature? Prefer to be doing something while
So
having
maybe like a
fidget. Yeah, okay.
Or even like sometimes like my kids like to like listening to music, like they stay more focused if like they're listening to music, they'll draw longer.
Sure. Yeah. And I would say that there's plenty of tools out there that support that kind of learner. I think that's a very typical profile for a lot of people who do like to fidget with something. That's why there's all those fidget spinners and all of the fidget toys and thinking putty. Because sometimes that does actually help a child's attentional system to just be able to hold their attention a little bit easier. I don't know that it's something that they will outgrow. I don't know that we can say for sure if it's something that they'll outgrow or not. But I think what it might be telling you more importantly is that the child might be struggling to attend. And so they're seeking some sort of external support to help them in that moment.
I agree.
I have a question. Is there like a certain age that you need to obtain that executive functioning in order to have it later in life? Like language is like birth to 3, you know, but it doesn't matter. And like, it's better to get the kids getting the executive functioning practice and for like.
I think it's helpful the question was, is there a certain point at which you have to have
Like a window.
the window for executive function development? And I think certainly, we know it develops in many ways throughout the life, but at the same time, the more you can put some of those things into place during those crucial periods, like Becky was saying with research, the better, but there are opportunities to keep developing. Would you agree?
Right. And I would say also that your executive functions, what we didn't mention, they're part of your frontal lobe. And so your frontal lobe is your higher order thinking, your goal-directed behavior, and that really doesn't fully develop until your early 20s. And so that's part of your brain that's going to continue growing and developing. So it's the trajectory that we want to be on, that we're providing opportunities. It doesn't mean, that's the tricky thing with executive functioning, is we all have strengths and weaknesses. You can probably think of yourself and have weaknesses in certain areas, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily missed a developmental period to gain it. It just might be the way that you function. It could be for certain kids, the ones who have some traumatic experiences in their life, they might miss some opportunities because of the trauma. But in general, there's a longer runway for developing executive functioning skills. And that's why we sort of look at accommodating some of those aspects just for success and independence early on.
So when teenagers make bad decisions, it's not their fault.
I mean, some research would say that their frontal lobe is still developing. So they're right for making lots of bad decisions.
That's funny. Was there any more? I think there's one more.
I think that might be it.
Is that it?
No.
Unless there were some in the chat. These were mostly-
Excellent information shared. Thank you. Okay.